Growing up, it was just me and Mom. Dad left when I was really young, so he's just a faded memory. Mom worked really hard, juggling multiple jobs to keep us going and make sure I could do well in school. Because of her sacrifices, I got a scholarship that paid for college, so I didn't have to deal with the huge debt many people have these days. I studied business management, driven by a mix of ambition and fear of being as poor as we were when I was a kid. After graduating, I moved to the city. It was tough at first, living in a tiny apartment and eating cheap noodles more often than I'd like to admit. But I landed a job at a big company, starting as a junior and quickly moving up the ranks. A few years later, I wasn't just working there, I was running a whole department. It was more than a job to me, it was my domain. I made sure everyone on my team knew they were valued. During training sessions, I tell the newbies, lead with respect. Treat this job like you own it, and soon you'll be leading the team. The team was great, full of good people. When I got promoted to department head, we all went to a local bar to celebrate. It wasn't a fancy place, just a cozy spot with cold beer and lots of laughs. Here's to Maud, the boss lady. Simon, one of my oldest colleagues, raised his glass. Everyone joined in, clinking their glasses together. Thanks, guys, we're all in this together. Here's to kicking more ass and taking names, I shouted, and the team cheered back. That night, amidst all the celebration, I noticed a guy named Austin. He saw me looking and walked over with a confident grin. Couldn't help but notice the celebration. What's the occasion? He asked, leaning against the bar. Just a little career boost, I replied with a smile. I'm the new head of my department now, I said, trying not to sound too boastful. That's impressive. Must be a tough job, he replied, nodding appreciatively. I'm Austin, by the way. Maud. Nice to meet you, Austin. We started talking more seriously than I had planned. It turned out Austin was a financier and knew his way around numbers, just like I knew my way around project plans. Over the next 5 months, our casual dates turned into weekends together. Before long, I was spending more time at his place than my own. He had an amazing apartment with high ceilings, a view that made you want to show it off, and a warmth that my dingy rental couldn't match. One evening, as we looked at the city lights from his balcony, Austin turned to me with a serious look on his usually playful face. He took my hands, and I could feel his nervous energy. Maud, these past months with you have been the best of my life. I know this might seem fast, but when you know, you just know, right? He started, his voice a mix of certainty and hope. I nodded, the cityscape blurring as my heart raced. He pulled out a small box from his jacket and opened it to reveal a ring that sparkled in the light. Will you marry me, Maud? Yes, Austin, absolutely yes, I managed, my voice thick with emotion. And just like that, I was engaged to a man who truly saw me and loved all the parts of me, even the tough ones. The day I was supposed to meet Austin's parents, my stomach was in knots. As Austin drove us up to a sprawling mansion with a driveway longer than my entire apartment block, I realized they were more than well off, they were rich. Stepping out of the car, I felt the weight of the place. The house looked like something out of an old British movie, all brick and ivy with gargoyles staring down like they knew I didn't belong. Austin squeezed my hand as we walked up to the huge oak doors. You'll be fine, Maud, he whispered, but his voice sounded like he was trying to convince himself too. The door swung open, and there stood Mr. and Mrs. Michael. His suit probably cost more than my rent, and her dress was something you'd see in a magazine. The foyer was massive, with a sparkling chandelier overhead. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking people with titles like Sir and Lady. Maud, lovely to finally meet you, Mrs. Michael said. I'm Maxime, and this is my wife, Sydney, Mr. Michael said, his voice smooth but cool with a hint of a practiced English accent. Mrs. Michael gave me a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Pleased to meet you both, I managed, trying to keep my voice steady as we moved into the dining room. Austin whispered quick tips about which fork to use, but his words were a jumble in my head. Dinner was served, and it felt like sitting in a freezer. The air was so cold with judgment. Mr. Michael pointed to a portrait of a stern-looking man with a thick beard. "That's Sir Daniel Michael, a direct ancestor from Canada. He came over in the 1500s to establish our family here," he said proudly. "Really impressive," I said, trying to sound enthusiastic, but it was hard to eat when I felt like every move was being critiqued. I reached for what I thought was the salad fork, but the silence that followed told me I'd messed up. I glanced at Austin for help, but before he could whisper anything, Mrs. Michael's voice cut through. "Perhaps things are done differently where you come from, dear," she said, each word sharp and precise. "Sorry, still getting the hang of all this," I mumbled, my cheeks burning hot. Austin tried to smooth things over by jumping into a story about us, but his parents were more interested in watching me struggle with the dessert spoon next. I felt smaller with each course, their stares heavy on my shoulders. After the icy dinner, we all shuffled into the Michaels' expansive living room. The plush carpets and heavy curtains made the room feel even more suffocating than the dining hall. I sunk into one of the ornate chairs, feeling like I was an exhibit in a museum about commoners. Mrs. Michael, perched elegantly on the edge of her seat, leaned forward. "Maud, dear, tell us more about your family. Your upbringing must have been quite different from ours," she said. I hesitated, feeling Austin's tense gaze on me. "Well, it was mostly just me and my mom. My dad left when I was really young, and I don't remember him much. Mom did everything to raise me on her own. She's a nurse." The room fell silent. Mrs. Michael stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the wood floor like a scream. "This is unacceptable," she declared, her voice resonating with disgust. "We are descendants of an ancient English lineage. We have standards, traditions. I cannot and will not allow my only son to marry someone without pedigree or knowledge of her own lineage." Mr. Michael, who had been silently observing, finally spoke. His words were calculated, each one heavy with meaning. "It's essential for us that our family ties are strong and well documented." "Maud, can you even name your great-grandparents?" I felt my face heat up with embarrassment. "I only know about my maternal grandparents," I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Michael rolled his eyes, showing his contempt. "This is exactly what we feared," he muttered under his breath. Austin finally intervened, his tone firm yet pleading. "Mom, Dad, please. Maud is kind, hardworking, and she loves me. Isn't that what should matter?" His mother's gaze was steely. "Respect and adherence to our family standards are what matter, John. If Maud is to join this family, she must learn our ways. She needs to respect where she is coming from, even if it is nowhere significant." Their words stung, cutting through the warm feelings from earlier in the evening. But Austin was looking at me, his eyes begging me to just go along with it. I nodded reluctantly, agreeing to their terms. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'll learn about your family and your traditions." Mrs. Michael seemed somewhat pleased by my concession. "Good. You'll start by familiarizing yourself with our family tree and understanding who each person in those portraits is. It's not just about names, Maud. It's about respect for our lineage." As they continued talking about their expectations, I felt a part of me shrivel up. The evening had turned from a simple meet and greet into a trial by fire. I had agreed to their demands, yes, but at what cost? As the room filled with discussions of ancestors and noble deeds, I couldn't help but feel alienated from these people and, oddly enough, from the parts of Austin that were tied so tightly to them. The weeks following that stiff dinner were a whirlwind. I barely had time to catch my breath between working my day job and attending the slew of etiquette and style courses that Mr. and Mrs. Michael insisted I take. My day started with the buzz of an alarm before sunrise and ended long after the sun had set, leaving me feeling like a zombie. "Elbows off the table, Maud," the etiquette instructor gently chided during one of our sessions. And remember, the soup spoon moves away from you when you scoop. I nodded, attempting to mirror her movements, but my mind was on a million other things like the mountain of work waiting for me back at the office and the never-ending wedding plans. "You're doing well," she reassured me, her voice soothing. "These things take time to become second nature." I gave her a weak smile. "Thanks, it's just a lot, you know." As if on cue, my phone rang. It was Mom. I excused myself and stepped outside to take the call, pressing the phone against my ear while trying to find a quiet corner in the bustling city. "Hi, Mom," I greeted, my voice more tired than I intended. "Maud, darling, how are the wedding preparations going?" she asked, her voice filled with excitement and a hint of concern. I hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "It's all good. Learning a lot. I even picked up how to waltz," I said, trying to keep my tone light. There was a pause, and I knew she wasn't entirely convinced. "You sound exhausted, honey. Are you getting enough rest? You know, all this shouldn't be so hard. You need to take care of yourself." I chuckled weakly. "I'll try, Mom, but there's a lot to juggle right now. Etiquette classes, dance lessons, work, and the wedding planning. Just remember what's important, Maud. It's you and Austin at the end of the day, not all these rules and lessons." Her words were comforting, but as soon as we hung up, the weight of reality settled back on my shoulders. I was caught in a tug-of-war between pleasing Austin's parents and maintaining my sanity. Every day felt like a marathon with no finish line in sight. Back inside, I resumed my training. The instructor's voice was a droning background noise as I practiced the proper way to hold a wine glass, pinch the stem, not the bowl, apparently. In the rare moments of downtime, I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if all this was worth it: the constant scrutiny, the endless classes, the cold looks from Mr. and Mrs. Michael whenever I slipped up, which was more often than I liked to admit. One evening, as I was about to drift off to sleep, my phone buzzed. It was Austin, his text lighting up the screen. "How was your day? Miss you." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out my frustrations and fears, but I held back. Instead, I typed a simple, "Miss you too. Long day but all good." As I set the phone down, the silence of my apartment felt overwhelming. Was this how it was going to be? Pushing through the exhaustion, smiling through the stress, all for the sake of fitting into a world that seemed increasingly alien to me. The big day had finally arrived. The venue was a flurry of flowers, fancy dresses, and the faces of the city's high society milling about. My stomach was in knots as I tried to keep calm. I stood in my long, flowing white dress, trying to catch my breath. My mom came over and adjusted a curl on my forehead. "Everything will be just fine, Maud," she reassured me with a soft smile. I wanted to believe her, but as soon as the ceremony began, any hope of a peaceful wedding vanished. Austin's parents were in full superiority mode. Mr. Michael greeted guests with an air of boastfulness, while Mrs. Michael quickly pointed out to everyone how they had made everything possible. As the guests settled, I tried to mingle, but Mrs. Michael pulled me aside with a frosty smile. "Maud, dear, make sure our friends are taken care of. Fetch some drinks. There's a good girl," she instructed, gesturing towards a group of elderly gentlemen loudly discussing politics. "But I started, only to be cut off by her sharp glance. "No buts. You're practically family now. Show some initiative," she snapped. Reluctantly, I carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres between tables, my dress trailing behind me. The weight of the fabric and the task made me feel more like a servant than a bride. I caught glimpses of Austin laughing and chatting, oblivious to my plight. As I passed another round of drinks, I overheard Mrs. Michael's voice rise above the chatter. "Maud will be serving us tonight. It's good practice for her, don't you think?" Her tone was condescending, her eyes keening the crowd for approval. That was the last straw. I approached her, my hands shaking slightly but my voice firm. I am not a waitress at my own wedding. There are staff here who are supposed to do this. Mrs. Michael stood up, her expression one of mock surprise. You should be grateful we allowed such a simple girl into our family. Remember your place, Maud, she hissed, her words like daggers. I felt a flush of anger rise to my cheeks. This is my wedding, not a performance for your friends, I retorted, my voice louder than intended. The room fell silent, all eyes on us. Austin, catching the tail end of our exchange, stumbled over, a glass of champagne in hand. What's going on here? He slurred slightly, his eyes not fully focusing. Your mother is treating me like a servant at our wedding, Austin. This isn't what today is supposed to be about, I said, frustration boiling over. Austin looked between me and his mother, his expression clouding. Maud, why are you making a scene? Just do what my mom asks. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal, Austin. This is our day, and your mom is ruining it. I shot back, disbelief and hurt swirling together. He took a long sip of his champagne before speaking. Look, Maud, you should be happy. I even chose you. There were plenty of girls better than you, prettier, richer. You're making a fuss over nothing. The words felt like a physical slap. I recoiled, the realization hitting me hard. The man I loved, the man I was about to marry, didn't see us as partners. To him, I was just another accessory, something to fit into the perfect image his parents wanted. As I clutched my bouquet tighter, feeling like I might crumble right there, my mom came over. She took one look at me and wrapped me in her arms, the kind of hug that seemed to hold the world at bay. Honey, do you love this man? Do you really want to marry him? She whispered, her voice filled with worry. I shook my head, barely able to speak. No, Mom, I can't do this. I don't want to. Mom nodded, her jaw set in that determined way I knew so well. She gently took the bouquet from my hands and guided me to a chair, her touch reassuring. Then, with surprising sprightliness, she approached the DJ, asked for the microphone, and turned to face the gathered crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the murmurs, drawing every eye in the room to her. There was a hush, the kind that precedes a storm. She took a deep breath and turned to face Mr. and Mrs. Michael directly. I have something important to share about truth and pretense, she began, her gaze unwavering. I went to the same school as Maxime and Sydney Michael. Back then, they didn't carry an English accent or boast of noble blood. Their families were hardworking folks, just like ours. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Maxime's father was a mechanic, and Sydney's mother served tables at the local diner. She paused, letting the words sink in. The portraits, the accents, the surname, they bought them all to craft a past that would hide where they really came from. The room erupted into whispers, guests turning to stare at the Michaels, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Mrs. Michael stood up, her face red, the facade of aristocracy melting away. That's preposterous. But my mom wasn't finished. To think that you would stand on these fabrications and look down upon my daughter, judge her worthiness based on a lie. Maud is worth 1,000 of your false titles. She is real, something you've long forgotten how to be. The guests were now openly murmuring, their looks of fascination turning to disdain as they gazed at the Michaels. Mr. Michael tried to speak, his accent slipping into something less refined and more desperate. We did what we thought was best. For whom? My mom cut him off, her voice fierce. For your son? For society? Or just for your own shallow pride? The confrontation had drawn everyone's attention, and now the room was buzzing, the atmosphere charged with tension and revelations. The Michaels seemed to shrink, their grandeur dissolving into the air, leaving nothing but the stark, plain truth of their origins. Austin's face twisted with a mix of shock and anger. He stormed up to me, his voice barely a hiss as he leaned close. You've ruined everything, Maud. You've disgraced my family. And now you're questioning if I want to marry you after this spectacle." His words stung, but before I could respond, he grabbed my arm, pulling me slightly closer. "I'll teach you how to be a good wife, one who knows her place and obeys." His threat hung in the air, heavy and chilling. I pulled my arm back with all my might, stepping away from him. The room was dead silent now, everyone's eyes on us. This was the man I had intended to marry. This was the family I was about to join. No, this couldn't be my life. I took a deep breath, my mother's earlier strength flowing through me. "There will be no wedding," I announced loudly, making sure every guest heard. I regret that I ever considered marrying someone who truly matches the arrogance and deceit of his parents. Murmurs filled the room, some of shock, others of support. Austin stood there, mouth agape, as if trying to catch the words and stuff them back into my mouth. My mother came to my side, her presence a comforting shield against the chaos. Together, we walked through the crowd, our heads held high. In the weeks that followed, news of the Michaels' disgrace spread through the city. Their fabricated lineage and high society standing crumbled like a house of cards in a breeze. People who once revered them now crossed the street to avoid their shame. They sold their mansion and moved away, seeking a fresh start where their past wouldn't haunt them. As for Austin, I realized I was free from a life of lies and manipulation. I began to find myself again, living a life where I didn't have to pretend or fit into someone else's mold. My mom and I grew closer, and I discovered that real happiness comes from being true to yourself. I heard bits and pieces, rumors of Austin's downward spiral, of nights spent at bars trying to drink away the scandal. I didn't know if they were true, and frankly, I didn't care. He had shown his true colors, and they were too dark and twisted for me to ever want to look back. "Thank you, Mom," I said to her one evening as we sat in our modest living room, a stark contrast to the opulent falsity I had almost married into. "For everything, for being there, for standing up for me, for helping me see the truth before it was too late." She took my hand, squeezing it gently. "I'll always be here, Maud. You're my daughter, and I raised you to be strong and true. No man, no family can ever make you less than what you are." We sat there, the TV chattering in the background, a normalcy that felt refreshing. I had lost a fiancé but gained back my life, my self-respect, and more importantly, my future. After the whole wedding debacle, going back to work felt like walking into a sanctuary. My colleagues who had heard about the chaos were nothing short of supportive. "Maud, you dodged a bullet, girl," Simon said as soon as I walked into the office. He was leaning against my desk, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, which he handed to me as a peace offering or maybe a welcome back gift. "Thanks, Simon. Feels good to be back," I replied, taking the coffee and savoring the familiar bitter warmth. And yeah, that bullet was more like a cannonball. "Anyone who makes you serve guests at your own wedding is no husband material. You deserve way better, hun," Sabrina chimed in from her cubicle across the way. I smiled, grateful for the camaraderie. "I think so too. It's nice to be back where I'm appreciated for what I do, not for the family I might have married into." As the days turned into weeks, the support from my team didn't waver. It was during this healing time that I met Andrew. He was a friend of a friend, nothing fancy about his background, just a genuine guy with a quick smile and an easygoing attitude that was infectious. We met at a small get-together, just a few friends hanging out on a Saturday afternoon. He was there, laughing at something silly when I walked in. "Hey, you must be Maud," he said, standing up to greet me. "I've heard a lot about you. All good things, I promise." "Thanks, Andrew. I hope they didn't embellish too much," I replied, trying to match his easy demeanor. We hit it off instantly. His family was the polar opposite of the Michaels. The first time I met Andrew's parents, and they welcomed me with warm hugs and genuine smiles. "Maud, we're just glad Andrew found someone who makes him so happy," his mom said, pulling me into a hug as soon as I stepped through their front door. It was refreshing, the simplicity of it all. No pretenses, no demands, just mutual respect and acceptance. Andrew and I weren't rushing anything. We were taking our time getting to know each other beyond the surface level. We enjoyed long walks, quiet dinners, and endless conversations about our dreams and goals. I found myself relaxing in his company, appreciating the normalcy and ease that marked our growing relationship. It was a stark contrast to the pressure and expectations I had faced with Austin and his family. Back at work, things were also looking up. My colleagues continued to be supportive, and the office felt like a second home. One day, my boss called me into his office. "Maud, I just want to say we've all noticed how you've handled everything. It's not been easy, but you've managed to keep your performance top-notch." I nodded, unsure where this was leading. "We think it's time for another promotion. You've proven you can handle just about anything, and your leadership has never wavered." Leaving his office, I felt a surge of pride. With a new relationship developing, a career on the rise, and the respect of those I cared about, I was finally in a place where I felt I belonged. It was a complete turnaround from the chaos and heartbreak I had experienced with Austin and his family. Andrew's family continued to welcome me with open arms. Every visit to their home was filled with laughter and warmth. His parents would share stories from Andrew's childhood, and we would all sit around the kitchen table, enjoying simple, hearty meals. I felt like I was part of their family, and the feeling was mutual. They appreciated me for who I was, not for some image or status. At work, I took on new challenges and responsibilities with confidence. My team respected my leadership, and we achieved our goals together. The promotion brought new opportunities, and I embraced them, knowing that I had the support of my colleagues and superiors. As the months went by, Andrew and I grew closer. We celebrated our small milestones, like the first time he met my mom and the first holiday we spent together. Each step forward felt natural and right. There was no rush, no pressure, just a steady building of a strong, loving relationship. One evening, after a particularly good day at work, Andrew and I were sitting on his couch, watching a movie. He turned to me and said, "Maud, I don't know what the future holds, but I know I want you in it." I smiled, feeling the truth of his words. "Me too, Andrew. Me too." It was in that moment that I realized I had found what I was looking for, not just in a partner, but in life. I had a loving relationship, a fulfilling career, and the support of people who truly cared about me. I had found my place, and it felt like home.